Welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast where we inspire growth, beat down biases, and get into all sorts of good trouble, with co-hosts Jonathan Beale and Britt East.
No topic is off limits as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy.
So get ready to join us for some courageous conversation, because Not Going Quietly starts right now.
Hello everyone, welcome to Not Going Quietly, the podcast for heartbroken healers and outraged optimists all over the world, where we surface life's searing truths in the name of radical togetherness. My name is Britt East, your co-host, and I'm with my fantabulous co-host, Jonathan Beale. Jonathan, how are you today?
I'm good. The question is, how are you? It's been a rocky week for the threat of a return of, the one we don't name. How's that going?
I know. We were joking just before we started recording here that in the U.S., when we're recording this in mid-November, we just had an election where we just missed out on fascism. Total fascist control over the U.S. government, missed by about a vote or two. So we're going to call that a win. That's where we are as a nation. The bar is low, admittedly. But, it could be worse. We could have a head of lettuce for our prime minister, like in the UK. So it could always be worse.
Like we have for the last 12 years. Yeah.
Not
going away anytime soon either.
I know. But, in a much happier note, we're here with an amazing guest today. I've been looking forward to this talk for so long. I've been following him on social media and learning a lot from all of his work. Today we are joined by Bryson Syliboy. Bryson is a Mi'kmaq activist from Duegneg. His pronouns are Nigam, he, his. Bryson is Two-Spirit and is currently attending Nova Scotia Community College Nautical Institute and the Marine Navigation Technology Management course. He has worked in the marine industry for over 20 years and is currently upgrading his marine licenses. Brian is passionate about 2S LGBTQIA+ and Indigenous issues, using his voice online to educate on these issues. Bryson is the son and relative of several residential school survivors and is also an Indian day school survivor. He lives in Duegneg with his partner. Now, for those of you on YouTube, you'll notice that Bryson is in some pretty spiffy duds here today, rocking the epaulets. Bryson, how are you? And what's with the uniform? You have to tell us what's going on.
I'm doing great. So I'm in my school uniform at the moment. We don't wear this every day, which is good because it's a little stuffy. But we had a epaulette ceremony today, so I'm in a 4-year program, and so like the first years get their name tags and their anchors or their propellers if they're in do engineering. So yeah, I'm in a nautical institute, and so this was my last one.
Wow!
So now I'm all spiffy.
Congratulations. That's really awesome. That's an achievement, and congratulations. We're just so thrilled to have you today. And, I want to start this conversation. There's so much for us to learn and so much education, and we're just so lucky to have you. I want to start by acknowledging, that Europeans began incursions of what many people now call North America over 500 years ago. But at least according to the science that I've read as a layperson, so, take it for what it is, there have been native peoples living and thriving on this land for over 23,000 years prior to contact. I mean, 23,000 years. That's like beyond human comprehension. You might as well just say they've always been here, even if they came from various places. 23,000 years is so long that you might as well just say they've always been here. And that means that everything that we call the U.S. and Canada exists on stolen, unceded land, that invaders, settlers, colonists acquired it by force as part of some genocidal campaign to eradicate people, language, and culture in order to expand markets and consolidate power to feed their capitalist economies. I mean, let's just be honest about it. And while not all of us living on this land are direct descendants from the original invaders, we all benefit from what they did in a myriad of ways from that genocide, many of which we will likely never even understand. So it's important we start from that beginner's mind, and I encourage the audience to go there, that place of not knowing. We know that we don't know. So Bryson, I'd like to invite you to correct anything I've gotten wrong and share anything you would like to about your tribal nation.
I'm from the Mi'kmaq Nation. We're here in Nova Scotia, Canada. We're part of a confederacy called the Wabanaki Confederacy. So it's a bunch of different nations together. I think there's 5 of us in total. So we've had European contact since the 1600s. What we say here in Mi'kma'ki, which is where I'm from, we say we've been here for time immemorial. So, we've always been here. The earliest known settlements for my area is about 15,000 years old. So, we've been here for quite a little bit. That's pretty much it.
It's so interesting, and again, I just invite you to correct me anytime I get something wrong. I'm learning, and that will only help me to learn and help our listeners. But I suspect a lot of us are confused about the concept of a native nation, meaning a sovereign country that exists within another sovereign country. Because of the invasion and incursion. For instance, in the U.S., the Cherokee Nation exists as a sovereign nation within the United States. A lot of our listeners are from all over the world, and so this way of thinking might be new for them. And I know just from people I talk with in the U.S., it's tough for us to understand, as well. And depending upon the aspect of the law in question, in some cases, U.S. federal law reigns, and in other cases, tribal law reigns. And the relationship between those laws is dynamic and uneasy and complicated. And then to further complicate matters, some native nations are not even recognized by the U.S. government, while others are. And there's a lot of tension between the nations and the U.S. So it's really complicated. Is this kind of how it works in the First Nations in Canada? I'm so ignorant about Canada as a good American. I know nothing about the rest of the world. And then if it resonates, if it applies to you, what is it like living with this dual citizenship and navigating both worlds?
For us Mi'kmaq, our territory goes from Newfoundland almost to Boston, right? So.
Wow.
I actually have dual citizenship for the states, but I am also a sovereign nation. So you have to figure that out. It's hard to understand that. And that's not even that complicated because we just have that. But there's the Haudenosaunee in New York and Ontario area. Well, they have to deal with being Canadian American, and then have to deal with being New York and I think what's the other state right next to New York?
New Jersey, Pennsylvania. Oh, Pennsylvania probably.
Maybe,
I don't know. I'm from America.
And then
I don't know.
Ontario and Quebec. That's where their reservation is on. Wow. It's on 4 different provinces and states. So. Yeah, it's really complicated. So you have to worry about what's this province doing, what's that province doing, or what's this state doing. Yeah, so it's a lot of headaches.
Probably just see my eyes going, what?
Yeah. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. In the UK, it's what?
How do you navigate that? So as a citizen, you are able to navigate those lands freely because of the way that it's arranged.
Yeah, because especially for my area, we have the treaty called the Jay Treaty, and it does allow us to freely move from province to province and state to state for my nation.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, like, you know, like I grew up in Boston, you know. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really cool. You know, I think when a lot of our audience, and frankly me, you know, first started learning about indigeneity, you know, in this side of in this hemisphere, we sort of thought or think of indigenous people as being of one race. And I think one of the big surprises to me to learn is that there are Native peoples racialized in all sorts of different ways. Some Native peoples have darker skin tones, some have lighter skin tones, some might identify as Afro-Indigenous even. Some might even be racialized as white by some people. Some might have straight hair, some might have curly hair. So citizenship really seems to be a big part of it from what I'm learning. And, you know, some Native peoples have first or last names that are indistinguishable from non-Native names. So you can't make assumptions or about somebody's identity based on your history of whiteness, we'll just say, or non-nativeness. And so when you put it all together, it just is like, you know, wow, it's really complicated. And it's like, it seems like that's why the concept of citizenship is so important. That, you know, and then different Native nations have different enrollment requirements, just like different non-Native nations do. It kind of reminds me of the European Union in a way. That's not a great comparison, but, you know, where you have a collection of countries working with a larger whole. When you think about pan-Native nations and individual Native nations, and there's like 500 or something just in Canada, and there's at least that many in the U.S. It's not all based on a blood quantum requirement. Sometimes it is. It changes as well. Some require you grow up in tradition while others don't. And I think the big thing I'm kind of getting at is that all of these nations have unique, rich cultural traditions, heritages, community requirements, even if non-natives have stolen or attempted to eradicate many of those, along with the languages. Those heritages still exist. And so we can't, as white people or as non-native people, we are missing the boat when we think of Native peoples as one collective whole, one monolith. Just like not all gay people are the same, all queer people are the same, not all Black people are the same, not all Native people are the same. And racial integration has been a big consequence of colonization. It was a big part of it for all sorts of reasons. So here's my question. What are we as contemporary non-Native people supposed to do with all our family lore and genetic research, which suggests possible maybe we have some mystical, magical kinship with a particular Native nation? We go on 23andMe. You know, Elizabeth Warren in the U.S. running for president was a notable example of this. You know, I'm 1 millionth Cherokee, and now for some reason I feel the pull to claim that identity based on that, you know, pop culture genetic testing that I did. And then what is the difference between having a genetic connection with a Native nation versus having kinship with that nation?
That's an excellent question. You know, like, like I explore that a lot because, you know, like I didn't really grow up in the culture. I grew up on a reservation. But as a child of residential school survivors, you know, like I wasn't immersed in our culture because my parents wouldn't allow it. You know, they went through the schools, got their culture, their language, their everything stripped away from them. So, you know, like I'm still reconnecting. You know, like I'm 41 years old. I don't know much about my background, even though I grew up on a reservation. And, you know, like, yeah, you know, it's all about like just learning. I think the best thing for like settlers to do is just learn from where you are, particularly in where you live. You know, like you don't look at the big picture, just look at the like little tiny area you're in, because, you know, there's a lot of rich nations just in that area that you live. You know, like I'm lucky here in Mi'kmaq, like we're just one nation. Like we do all of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI. So we're all, like it's easy. But like if you go west and there's, 5 or 6 territories in just one city. So yeah, it's a lot of just trying to find the little nuances, and there's a lot of great websites that that show you where the nations are. I think there's one called Whose Land. That's a great resource. It's not 100% right, but it's a stepping stone.
Yeah. We're going to link to all sorts of resources in the show notes, listeners, so you don't have to scramble to take notes. Bryson has a wealth of information from other podcast appearances and articles he's written and sites he's referencing, so we'll make sure you get all that in the show notes because there's a lot to learn. And I happen to live in Seattle, which is, like Bryson was alluding to, a land of great richness where it comes to Native nations. And some of which, again, are federally recognized by the U.S. government, some of which are not, a lot of which are fighting against each other on various issues, just like other non-Native countries do. They have sovereignty issues that rise up among themselves, like I said, with the imperfect comparison with the EU and nation states advocating for themselves on various issues. Native nations do the same thing. And so I love that advice because there is so much to learn, where I live, just here, in fostering real relationships with real people. So it's not just some esoteric, arcane thing we read in a book or on a website. It's about knowing and loving and learning from each other and building relationships with people. You alluded to the fact, like I said, not a lot of purely international news makes it to the U.S. We're kind of into ourselves a little bit, as I'm sure you've heard. But, we did hear about all that started in 2021 with the finding of more unmarked graves that you were alluding to at former sites of residential schools in Canada. And that was a really great distraction from us in terms of looking at our own residential schools, which there are obviously plenty in the United States, and we conveniently have made this a Canadian problem. Frankly, we have not in the U.S. kept pace with even whatever meager steps Canada's taken. I'm sure we are far behind that in the U.S. And if our audience has never heard of this issue, and again, we'll give you links, they're essentially, this is my term, concentration camps for Native children who are stolen from their families, indoctrinated with Christian beliefs, and terrorized in all sorts of ways, including murder. And the least of which was eradication of culture and language and dress and identity. And it's not a distant history. I mean, I think there were some of these schools operating well into the 1990s. So some of these kids would still be alive today. They'd be elders in the community, which means there was an untold, irreplaceable wisdom stolen. And it reminds me somewhat, again, an imperfect comparison of the generation of gay men lost, at least in the U.S. due to the AIDS epidemic, where the rest of us had to grow up in the shadow of that loss without the wisdom. Our birthright was stolen from us by the U.S. government. It seems like maybe there's something similar at work here. Not only there was a human toll to reckon with, but a generation of lost wisdom. And you wrote a really moving article in the newspaper last year about this. Like I said, we'll link to in the show notes. My question is, what would you like our audiences to know about residential schools and the impact they have had on your family and community?
Well, the impact's being still felt today. Here in Canada, the last residential school closed in 1996. I was 15 years old when the last one closed. It's impacted my community a lot because our reservation was 2 kilometers away from the school. I grew up looking at the school out of my elementary school window, and dealt with the repercussions of that. My family, all of my family went there. My grandparents, my aunts and uncles, and a lot of my older cousins too. So, the impact's still being felt today because, like, I don't speak my language. I don't practice any of my culture, really. I do, I'm proud of it, but I don't know it. And, that shows how, like, successful the residential school system was, because it literally was there to kill the Indian in the child. And that's what it did, even today, like in Canada, like the Canadian Food Guide, which is, the simplest of things, was formed by doing experiments on Native children. My grandparents were actually some of the test subjects.
Wow.
Yeah. So, yeah, it's a big, huge impact that a lot isn't really well known. Like, how it's scoped out is, it seems like it's in the past because they only show black and white photos. They only show like records from the 20s and the 30s or the 1800s. So, but that was still going on in 1996.
Wow.
And, they try to, like, purposely push it to a narrative that they think that it needs to be. And, I highly encourage people to do your own research, read the actual, like, testimonials for the inquiries. That's where it boils down to, survivors are still living.
Yeah.
It amazes me the lengths that nations will go to hide their shame via controlling narrative around history. The UK, we've got plenty of that going on. The US, Canada, I'm sure, is exactly the same. And I know that podcasts like this go some way to bridging the gap and changing the narrative and educating people. But how do we overcome the propaganda that is constantly going, that is trying to convince us that, for instance, the US or UK colonialism has been a good thing when it's clearly not been? How do we change that? I know it's a massive question. I don't expect to have the answer, but putting it out there.
Well, the best way to do that is to listen to the voices of the people that are affected. I always highly recommend reading a book, reading an article, watching a program that was written by Indigenous people. We know our stories, we know our history, we know what happened to us the best. There can be tons of people that are experts, especially settlers, they can be experts in anything, but they don't have that lived experience. That's where it boils down to. You gotta listen to the actual people.
Yeah, lived experience always trumps theory. Always. Lived experience always wins. That's my belief. Bryson, we started
white
today.
People love to tell.
Oh,
sorry,
especially men.
To say this one. White men do love to control the narrative and be right, don't they? About all subjects.
I could have a doctorate in women's study. I don't know how to be a woman.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sorry, we started this episode. We started this episode today saying that we know that we do not know, and then we have started to provide some resources. Another resource to self-educate I highly recommend is Native Twitter. I mean, Twitter is a shit show at the moment, obviously because of Elon, but Native Twitter is pretty amazing. And as long as you go in there and keep yourself on mute and just listen, and then maybe give a like button every now and again, you're going to learn a lot, and they're going to point you to some resources, just like any vibrant community would, like Black Twitter, or maybe not gay Twitter, we got problems, but other communities. So I highly recommend native Twitter. But where I was going is, okay, we started at zero. We know that we do not know. Now we've provided some resources. Let's go even deeper. Now that we have some knowledge as we self-educate and start listening and learning, what do we feel compelled to do? And so, for instance, when we talk about residential schools, what has been done that you're aware of over the past year in terms of these schools to make progress towards recognition, reparations, and reconciliation, at least in Canada? And what ongoing calls to action are Native peoples putting before the Canadian governments and society as a whole?
Oh yeah, that's a big question. Well, there is great progress. I'm not gonna lie, but it's slow progress.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of prominent people in Canada that are residential school deniers. They're denying the graves, that they died of abuse, or they didn't die of genocide, and that's our problem here right now is, you got a few vocal people that are just flat out deniers. And then, that snowballs into literally somebody on Twitter just, blurting out that I don't know what I'm saying, that I'm not native enough to talk about it. Even though I lived that.
Yeah.
So it's trying to weave through all that disinformation and it's difficult. But I think we are working towards reconciliation, but the thing is you can't have reconciliation until you have the truth, and the truth is being denied every day. And that's where I think a lot of white privilege can come into play, because having privilege isn't a bad thing at all. It's just how you use it. If you're going to use it to quash all the racism, all the denying, all even homophobia and all that, you use your privilege for good, and you quiet those voices so that our voices could be heard.
Mm-hmm. That's beautiful. And again, I keep coming back to, and this is kind of, I think, what you're getting at, is what do you feel compelled to do? Once you've been gifted this information, how do you reciprocate? How do you pay it forward? What are you going to do? An ally is different than somebody with an affinity. An ally is not somebody who lives without hate and has no malice in their heart. An ally is somebody who spends their lifetime lifting up others. It's not, we can't just call ourselves an ally because, hey, I see everybody as equal. That's just silliness. That's baby talk at this point. We all know, we've all been exposed to enough information to know that's just patently outrageous, that it comes down what we are willing to do, and often what we are willing to risk. And because this work, the work of allyship, or accomplice work, if you want to call it that, or comradeship, comes with a cost. As you start to resist white supremacy, you will pay a cost, just like you will when you resist straight supremacy or male supremacy. And that's why so few people do it. Not to mention the relentless toll of capitalism on our capacity. As we were working several jobs, raising several kids, it is tough. All of you listeners, you have our empathy and understanding. And still, what do you feel compelled to do? as you're gifted this information. And in, you know, my brief time sitting with Indigenous peoples, a lot of times they refer to the knowledge transfer as a gift, and then follow it up with, now what? Now I've given you this. What are you going to do about it? You know, kind of like the land back movement. Who cares about your land use acknowledgement statement on your website if you're not giving land back? You know, what does that boilerplate text help anybody? Sure, it's a beginning of an acknowledgement of some truth, but what are you doing? What is the call to action? So, Bryson, you know, I guess my question to you is, you know, where do we get started in the heavy lifting? So we've read some books, so we have talked to some Indigenous people. How can we actually start helping without looking like a tool? I mean, there's a lot of distrust for really good reasons from Indigenous peoples to white people who, quote unquote, want to help. You know, there's a long history, there's 500 years of history that's not going to be changed overnight. So if we say, for the sake of argument, somebody's heart's in the right place, they're backing that up with some beginning work, they're just starting, how can we, you know, start to do some of the heavy lifting, shouldering the burden without looking like a tool or causing offense?
Well, the key to that is, first, like, learning how to be a proper ally. You know, there are certain protocols you have to adhere to. Not all spaces are going to be for you. You know, there's, especially in Indigenous cultures, so, like, you know, a lot of ceremonies are not for you. You know, you got to learn how to, like, step away from places when you're told to. And not get hurt about that, you know, like, because it's not about you. Like, you know, if it's going to be about you, that means that you're being a performative ally instead of an actual ally, you know. And performative allyship is really, really, really harmful, you know, because it puts the settler into the center of the issue, and not the whole issue, like, focused on, you know, it's all about me. So, you know, like, it's just, you know, being an ally, people are going to make mistakes. That's okay. Learn from them. You know, I wrote a huge, like, 30-point thing about allyship, and I just let my feelings get into that, you know, like, what I feel like an ally should be, you know. And it's all about being humble, you know, doing your research, asking questions, not asking questions when it's appropriate, because, you know, you can't be like, hey, like, what do we do now? Or, you know, just help out, you know, just be there. As I said, you know, use your privilege for good.
I think we just had a T-shirt moment where Bryson was like, "Dear white people, it's not always about you." I was like, "What? That can't be right. I'm white."
Right. White and male, right?
White and male, exactly. What? I don't know. I don't understand these words. Go away. Oh my God. You know, as I understand it, part of the legacy of European invader settler colonists was to impose Christian values through force on Native people, starting with the killing and erasure of people who challenged these norms around gender and sexuality. And the genocide continued through the imposition and decimation of culture in the various residential schools that we were talking about. And that means in some cases, words, cultures, traditions of the people don't exist. They're gone. There's no record of them. And so one of the really beautiful things, as I understand it, that Native peoples have done out of a sense of need or desperation or whatever, is to band together, maybe much like people in the queer community, work together and leverage their collective efforts. So, like, words like Two-Spirit, for instance, is a pan-Native term that was coined in the 1990s by Native people seeking to reclaim a uniquely Indigenous identity separate from Western European terms like gay, lesbian, bi, trans. And according to my reading, some of the First Nations did not use social constructs like gender to classify and divide people. I read an excellent book on Two People recently that delved into that. And many of these nations did not even have words for genders in the way that Europeans would recognize, specifically people who speak Romantic languages. So there were no gendered words. And words reflect knowledge. So that means their entire concept of gender was vastly different from a different paradigm. So gendered cultures like gay, lesbian, and trans may not resonate for some Native peoples. On the other hand, some people might choose multiple identities and use labels like Two-Spirit and gay. Bryson, I guess my question is, how do you identify personally, and what would you like us to know about this Two-Spirit identity and community?
Yeah, I identify as Two-Spirit, and I identify as gay, because it's sometimes it's easier to say, hey, I'm gay, than explain. Unfortunately, for the Mi'kmaq Nation, our Two-Spirit identity has been wiped out. We have zero knowledge, zero word usage, zero anything about our Two-Spirit people pre-contact. It's just been wiped out from existence. All the texts, were written by European settlers, by priests, so all of that's gone. So we're in the middle of reclaiming it. We don't have a word for it really. The closest thing we do have is Willem Delski, which means I am proud. So we're just in the middle of a renaissance for reclaiming our Two-Spirit people. It's
I think what is kind of unsaid and what you explained is that you're part of a vibrant community in an exciting time, and Native peoples don't live as part of some black and white photograph, as you alluded to earlier. They live with us today, and they have rich lives today. And it's just because it's simpler for white non-natives to pretend natives look like one thing and think like one thing and exist in one frozen point in time, because then we don't have to reckon with our realities. We can mythologize our massacres. It doesn't reflect the truth. And obviously I'm sure there's a lot of struggle that goes with what you're describing, but maybe there's some vibrancy in there as well, and then some exciting, like you get to. I mean, that's at least for me when I think about the comparison with queer. Part of the thrill at first when I first came out in my teens was like, I don't have to live by your straight life scripts. And is it similar feeling for you? Like, do you feel like you don't have to live by settler colonist life scripts? You can create your own and your own identities. And does that feel thrilling and exciting?
Yeah, being in Two-Spirit right now as a Mi'kmaq person, I'm confused. I don't know what my place is in my culture right now, because we have we still have a lot of Catholicism happening on my reservations. I can't get married in my church on my reserve because they won't allow it, and stuff like that. So I'm at a crossroad of not knowing who I am, but I'm also I'm at that precipice where I'm looking out for the next 7 generations. So we're doing all this hard work now so that the next 7 generations cannot have it a little more easier than we do. So our bigger picture, we're looking at the bigger picture, really.
You're going to have to excuse my British ignorance. Obviously, we don't get exposed to Indigenous cultures over here. We are ostensibly the Indigenous culture, and so it's really new to me. And also, there's something about Two-Spirit, or the idea of not defining gender, that I find really interesting, because we live in perhaps the English language in such a binary state all the time, and how we see the world, how we experience the world, is how we describe it, right? And so I'm really curious, kind of from your perspective, because I'd really like to understand what Two-Spirit means for you. And I suppose by extension, what you hope, based on what you just said, what it would mean for those in 7 generations' time. Yeah.
Well, like my language, we're a verb-based language, so we describe everything, and so we never really had pronouns. I mean, well, we had pronouns, but we never assigned like gender to specific objects or such stuff like that. So being Two-Spirit is, for me, it's all about having that role in my community, that I guess to be a role model to younger queer Indigenous people, because how I grew up in the 80s, grew up in the 90s, where being gay wasn't acceptable, and being a BIPOC gay was even worse. You have to deal with that. Especially as I said, on my reservation, it's still shunned on, and pre-contact, it wouldn't mattered who you loved, and I just it's hard to describe my sexuality as an Indigenous person. I just can't, because I'm still lost, but I know we're in the process of reclaiming it and defining it and living it, and it's difficult. But yeah. I know, for me, I know how I want to be as a gay person is I want to leave a mark on my community. I want to leave a mark on my people. I want to make sure that they know that being who they are and who they love is all that matters. And it shouldn't bring them shame. It shouldn't bring them sorrow or hardship.
You're gonna make me cry. Happens every episode. Yeah, that is so beautiful. And I think, what touched me is that when you were speaking so vulnerably then, is we were getting a little window into your soul and the emotional labor that you have been required to do thanks to straight white supremacy, in particular invader, settler, colonist culture, and why it is appropriative for us as non-native white people to use terms like Two-Spirit, because the creation of the term was by Indigenous people to consciously separate themselves and reclaim a past that we tried to eradicate. Mm-hmm. And so when we as non-native say, oh, that sounds cool, I'm going to take that, that just continues the cultural eradication. And it's an act of violence. Yeah. It might seem innocuous in the moment, like hanging a dream catcher in your rearview mirror or whatever. It might feel innocuous, but it's really an appropriate act of violence. And I think what was so poignant is we got a window into your labor, and we can infer based on that why it is violent. You and your loved ones and your peers and your are working so hard to reclaim these identities, and for us to just immediately absorb them, that erases all of the labor, and you're forced to start over. So I think, what I was moved by, again, bringing this back to actions rather than just words, is that some of what we can do, as you said, is to do nothing and to listen and to create, support native spaces with our absence. Sometimes the greatest action we can do is nothing, and to refrain from some of these impulses. The white supremacy impulse is always going to be with us, but if we can refrain from these impulses and allow native people to flourish, they will. They're going to flourish. They're leading vibrant lives today. They don't need our handouts or support. They just need us to respect us, leave them alone. They need equity under the law and all of that, but they don't need us to fix anything for them. They need us to take down the systems of supremacy, and they will thrive of their own accord, like they did for 23,000 years. And so I was just so struck by that. Again, keep coming back to the fact that these are sovereign nations of people. And I think that change, like we as white people, I think like to think of Native people as purely a race because it's easier than to eradicate their civil rights. But in the same way that we would not invade Canada or Mexico, hopefully, Donald Trump notwithstanding, we would hopefully not invade a Native nation. When we tread on Native ground, that's visiting a foreign country. And I think that switch in our mentality would go a long way to helping us understand, helping us treat Indigenous peoples with more respect. And it just really touched me, when you shared, your story. I guess my question to you after all that is, part of me wonders, because I'm a language geek, part of me wonders if, part of the struggle, you were talking about a struggle to describe what it feels like to be Two-Spirit is because you were forced to do it in English. And I wonder if you had your birthright of your native tongue, if it might be different, because language is knowledge. It's a reflection of the way our mind works. And so it's like you're trying to describe a fork with a spoon. You're trying, our English language is, like Jonathan said, is mired in the gender binary. And so I can understand that it's like, does that resonate? Do you feel like as you learn, your language, as you continue to invest in your culture, some of these threads will be brought together? Is that the goal? Is that what you're working toward?
Yeah, I call myself like part of the lost generation, because we are directly the generation after residential school is closed. So like me and my cousins and my kin, we're all part of this lost generation that don't know what we're doing, don't have the cultural background, don't have the, the knowledge to be Indigenous, but we're surviving. That's the key. We are survivors, and I don't think I'll ever consider myself fully Mi'kmaq, or when I do get older, be a elder. I don't have that cultural background to justify any of that, but I see the revival of my culture sorry, I'm gonna cry. In are my younger cousins, my nieces and nephews. Sorry.
Okay.
So I know that Mi'kmaq culture will survive, and that will get stronger and stronger. It's just my generation didn't get that because of the legacy of colonialism, so it's I cry for everything, so don't mind me. It's something that makes me proud, that to see our next generations thriving in our culture, learning our languages, having that strong sense of being, You know, they know who they are. Yeah, and that's where I draw my strength. And you know, like, yeah, it definitely would have been easier to know how to speak my language. It just wasn't in my cards.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really beautiful, and just wanted to honor your tears in the heart space. I'm a crier as well, like I said earlier. So thank you for sharing that with us. It's very generous, and we really appreciate it. You know, I guess I also wanted to throw in there, I forgot earlier, that to remind our listeners that this is not a past struggle. This is a current struggle, an ongoing struggle. In the U.S., we just had a Supreme Court case here, oral arguments. It's called the Indian Child Welfare Act, that was established in 1978 as a way to preference the placement of Native children with Native families. And the reason that's under attack is because a white family adopted a Native child, and it wasn't, quote unquote, easy enough for them. There was some resistance in the Native community, and they want it to be easier. And so the Supreme Court in the U.S. agreed to hear this case, and it was shocking, not surprising, and embarrassing to sit there and listen, especially through the lens of Native Twitter, to the oral arguments and the questions that the justices on the Supreme Court asked, filled with ignorance, a lack of even lifting a finger to learn about our shared stories, just preening in privilege and basking in bigotry, and really happy to sit back with, you know, pretend questions, frankly. You know, and a decision from this court could end the practice of preferencing placements of Native children with Native families. And that's a big deal. That's part of the genocide. It's been a way for centuries to dilute Native populations and further cement our, quote unquote, ownership of the land that started 500 years ago with first contact by the invaders, colonizers, and settlers. And the implications in the decision are far reaching. Like, if the US government defines what they call, quote unquote, Indian as purely a race, that decision could be used as precedent to further erode sovereignties of all federally recognized Native nations, which is the point. So it's imperative that all of us get educated, as tired as we are, as capacity constrained as we are, as busy as we are, again, with the relentless push of capitalism. I mean, queer people know what it's like to live at the mercy of losing civil rights at a moment's notice, you know, but non-Native queer people aren't forced to grapple with the complex web of conflicting laws, like we talked about, many of which are explicitly designed to derail sovereignty and culture. So I guess where I was going, Bryson, with this is the concept of intersectionality. We've talked about this before in our podcast, but if listeners have not heard about this, this was developed by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw in the Black community as a way to say that people who have multiple identities, meaning all of us, experience bias and bigotry qualitatively differently than others. In other words, if I'm a Black woman, I experience misogyny and racism, but I experience it just not additively. I experience it qualitatively differently. The way we practice bigotry against white women, not misogyny against white women, is very different than the way Black women experience the intersection of racism with misogyny. So, Bryson, can you help us understand what it's like to live as a two-spirit person, a gay person of color, the intersection of the bias that you have to navigate, but then maybe also some of the joy and the magic that you bring to the world, the healing that you bring to the world because of these identities?
Yeah, intersectionality is important, you know, like, because like we, like, as groups, you know, quote unquote groups, we have to like band together because, you know, that's how you enact change, you know, like, but even then, like, you know, there's a lot of like problems with that too, because like not like some people kind of use it against at the same time too. Like there's people that will uphold white supremacy, even though they're a protected category. Like you see it all the time in the queer community. Like white gays will always uphold white supremacy, even though they're being attacked for their identity.
Yeah.
And it's just like it's hard to navigate that because it's such a delicate and robust issue. And it's just like we have to look into our communities and quash all of that in that community before we can work on the intersectionality. So like, yeah, like, and being a protected class doesn't negate you from being a homophobe, being racist, being ableist, being everything. Like I've had that a lot on Twitter. Like when I'm arguing with somebody, they'll be like, "Oh, I'm trans." Like like you're attacking me for that. I'm like, no, I'm attacking you because you're being racist. You're being anti-Indigenous.
Yeah.
People use their identity as a crutch, and as well. There's me. I'm being ableist by saying crutch. They use it as a protection. So it's with intersectionality, we have to like throw out those ideas and actually work together. Like, like as I say, like be humble. Take the licks when you get called out for things. Like I try to tell like people who want to be allies. I usually try to tell them, like don't look at the bigger picture. Just do one little thing. One little thing is something that really, really helps. Like writing a senator, writing an MP, writing, people saying, hey, like this needs to be correct. Like I support this, and I want to use my privilege as good. Stuff like that. Like, I can see it in my program. Like I call out our textbooks. Like they're written in for male form. Like they automatically call a captain him or his. I try to bring up the fact that like our textbook should be gender neutral. And that's how I'm using my privilege to make changes in my own program.
Yeah.
So like I try to always say, look at the little picture.
I think that's another t-shirt moment with Bryson. Look at the little picture. I absolutely love it. We could talk to you all day. I just learned so much from you. I'm so grateful. The show notes are going to be filled with links to other podcast appearances that Bryson has been on. He referenced the 30 Steps to Being a Good Ally. We're definitely going to link to that. It is incredible. So I really encourage everybody to listen to that. It's a 2-part podcast. So look for those links. And then also articles that he's written. So go to the show notes. It's going to have all sorts of information in it for you. Listeners, you've done it. You've made it through another hour of Not Going Quietly. We're so happy you joined us and to talk and listen about this really important issue that is with us today. It's a living issue, and there's so much that we can all be doing if we just focus on putting one foot in front of the other, like Bryson said, and focusing on the little picture. I think that's really great advice for all of us. Bryson, thank you from the bottom of my heart. It's been a joy to talk with you. I'll see you around on Native Twitter and Instagram and hopefully other podcasts. And please don't be a stranger. It's just been an absolute pleasure.
I'll definitely come back if you want me to. Like I enjoyed this a lot, and I appreciate you giving me a platform.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. All right, listeners, that's made it through this another episode. We thank you from the bottom of my hearts. Goodbye. Have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you soon. Thank you. Bye.
You've been listening to Not Going Quietly with co-hosts Jonathan Beal and Britt East. Thanks so much for joining us on this wild ride as we explore ways to help everyone leap into life with a greater sense of clarity, passion, purpose, and joy. Check out our show notes for links, additional information, and episodes located on your favorite podcast platform.